Perhaps I would like to open this conversation up to everyone from both panels who would care to join in. And I think we could just start with really focusing on some of your thoughts on our last panel. Have you questions for our panelists or comments that you'd like to make in response?
One of the most interesting questions, I suppose, is in a discussion of this kind, is how far can a modest-sized country in terms of population and economy, which is inevitably integrated into the world and into the Western system and the global system, that nonetheless has, as Margaret reminded us, enormous geographical scale and resources, how far can it follow its own path? Mm-hmm. And to the extent that it cannot, what sort of, I discussed that a bit, alliances and arrangements can it make with others that might multiply its power, particularly in the context of the multiple breakdowns in and between the two superpowers, which seems to me has been discussed in many different ways by the participants today. That seems to me the immediate challenge. Probably this is a question more for Margaret than anyone else, but I would be interested in anybody else's view, because it seems to me the biggest question for you as a country. Assume that you run your affairs well for the moment, let's assume that. Relatively well is not that difficult nowadays. What do you actually try to do in this world?
Heather, would you like me to?
Yes. Oh, yes, please. Sorry. I was listening so hard, I forgot to pass the ball.
It is, you know, we are in a curious situation that we are enormous geographically with enormous resources, and we're small in terms of population, we're small in terms of military power. I think we have a considerable amount of soft power, but these days soft power, I think, matters less, unfortunately, than it once did. The only thing I think we can do, and it's been, I think, a common theme in our history, is to work multilaterally. I mean, we have tended throughout our history to work as part of larger organizations. Initially, when we became a country within the British Empire, and we worked within the British Empire and often put pressure on London, along with other parts of the empire, to pursue policies we thought were desirable. And after the Second World War, we became very strong supporters of the United Nations and other international organizations, NATO, of course. And again, I think it was because we saw that we could amplify our power and project our values and our interests by being part of larger groupings. And we can do this, and there are certainly other like-minded countries in the world. You know, we can work with countries such as Japan, we can work with Australia, we can work with the Scandinavian countries, we can work with the European Union, we can work with Singapore. I mean, we have countries we can work with, but we still face the dilemma. And I don't know, you know, I think it may be insoluble. We face a dilemma that we live in a world in which we have superpowers who are increasingly antagonistic to each other. And I think this is a dangerous world for all smaller powers. It's dangerous, of course, for the great powers. And I hope I suppose the optimistic view, if I can be guardedly optimistic, is Martin's Wolf's view that we will get regional groupings. We'll get possibly a European Union, possibly an Asian grouping, and possibly a North American grouping. And the rest of the world will sort of decide which of those groupings or how many of those groupings it wants to work with. But it's not, I think, a formula for stability in the world, and I can't be too optimistic. I mean, I do want to be optimistic, but when I look at the international situation, I think, where does Canada fit in? It's not easy, and I think we have to do what we've always done and try and find multilateral organizations which will at least give us some protection and which will help to protect our interests and promote our values, but not easy at all at the moment.
I wonder if there are two questions, but just before I turn to them, I just might turn back to to Heather and Shawn and ask, though, we've been assuming, and because you spoke to the domestic panel, that in terms of the voices of Canada's Indigenous and First Nations peoples, that this is a domestic issue. And I wonder if you could just perhaps comment, or maybe enlighten some people that might be listening today, that how in fact it's no longer true that Indigenous peoples are simply domestic actors, right? That, I mean, there's an enormous amount of work going on, climate change, and when I think of of so many different issues that Canada's engaged with globally in the world, that in fact there are First Nations, Inuit people acting as international agencies and actors as well.
Very much so. It reminds me of, I won't go into too many details on this story, but it reminds me of when I was deployed for an international intervention during a major crisis where tens of thousands of lives were lost. And as an Indigenous leader, we went under our own steam. We advised the Canadian government. There was an interference. There was somewhat of a partnership when we landed on the ground. I met with Indigenous leaders that would otherwise have been recognized as have previously been in a civil war state with their nation state. To make a long story short, we supported, advocated for, facilitated their engagement through the United Nations Forum, under which a Scandinavian country came in and facilitated what essentially was an end to the martial law situation, as well as to the land dispute that was occurring during that major natural disaster, and an end to the civil war that had been undertaken. There are nation states that are comparably small that, as it were, might operate way above their weight through what Bill would perhaps describe as mutual accommodation. And that's a crisis that happened in one corner of the world that flashes across the headline and we go back to work. We're in a situation with COVID where every corner of the world is in this together. We're incredibly aware, all of us are, because of how it's impacting us in our bubbles, how we're interacting with and not hugging one another the way we might like. It's strained the relationship aspect. It's strained at mental health. It's strained at our desire as human beings and as many mammals. We want closeness, we want warmth, and we want connection. That's what we strive for. So the essence of Canada was always to strive for that understanding. We're a work in progress. We are where we are now. What we can do is we can accept where we've come from, work to more deeply and better integrate our historical narrative, not just as a way to understand, but to truly heal, to find that closeness and connection. Even hostage negotiators will tell you that in the most violent of situations, you can only achieve a potential path forward by getting connection. And that will be described at the international level, at the UN level, in nation state military conflicts. You have to, if you're going to find a solution through, listening to Margaret talking about the types of power that are expressed around the world, Indigenous peoples increasingly are, Heather, you're right, being actors in global affairs. There's a global network of Indigenous people who gather at various forums, both the formal forums like the UN, the Organization of American States, which I've participated in, and others. And so Indigenous peoples are increasingly doing what Canada's always been doing, establishing recognized adjacent institutions that support the growth and development of human beings. And so in Canada, we've got halls of government, we've got libraries, we've got museums, we've got chambers of commerce, we've got an education system. So too did Indigenous peoples. And so Indigenous peoples are very often in partnership with Canada now, as we're in the era of reconciliation, working to establish those adjacent, respected, recognized institutions that truly see and provide that sinew between peoples in the nation state for acting in the economy, etc. However, we've, as Indigenous peoples, to bring back to your point, Indigenous peoples will continue to grow those networks. Connectivity has improved the ability to do that. you know, our neighbors to the south. Heather Marie and I had the instance of listening to Bernice King, late Martin Luther King's daughter, say in front of 70,000 marchers here in Vancouver that we in America have not had our moment of truth and reconciliation. We've not had our moment of truth and reconciliation, she said, to thunderous applause by those who were gathered in 2014. And so we're feeling encouraged because there's deeper communication and deeper efforts to truly understand one another that are occurring so that we can co-create a better future.
Thank you. Well,
Margaret, sorry, Heather, is it all right if I just say a quick word? I wanted to say hi to my old friend, Shawn Atleo. Catherine and I have nothing but the fondest memory of our visit to his house on a house where we had an incredible experience of spending a couple of days, which included watching and listening to Shawn call the whales up to his boat, something that will stay with me forever. The United Nations declarations on the right of Indigenous people is going to play a key role. But I also think that we have so much to learn, especially in terms of stewardship, thinking generations, something that the Western world started in 1990 with Gro Harlem Brundtland, thinking, well, we have to do this sustainably, think about everything that we do and its effect on future generations. That's been part of the thinking, the philosophy for so long. We have a lot to learn around the world from Indigenous peoples. And I just wanted to say it was an honor to be able to take part today. I have to move on to another event and I'll have to let you go, but I just wanted to say thank you to William Macdonald. Bill, you mentioned your book, you talked about Shawn Atleo, and you mentioned that this is the great unfinished business in our continuing work of mutual accommodation, and I couldn't agree more, but it's priority. Thank you. Thank you, Heather.
thank you, Tom. I gather are you going?
I'm going to have to leave now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We've really appreciated your contribution. We'll talk again soon.
Yep.
If you'll still come to Trent after all that, if you'll still come to Trent. Thank you. We have a number, actually we have quite a few questions now that have come in, but we are coming to the end of our question period. So let me really read one that I think probably is more something reflective. And I'm going to read another one right after that I might invite everyone, and the one after that might in fact be the last question that everybody could reflect on before we join Bill Macdonald. So we have from Diana Tremaine, Shawn and Heather are deeply and beautifully rooted in the land and history of Canada. How does the immigrant coming from a war-torn country today develop that same deep-rooted love and loyalty of country? And the second question is from William Innes, who of course was one of the key instigators of the Canadian Difference Project. So welcome today, Bill. And I think it's right that perhaps you have the last question. And the question, well, I'll read it, it's a little longer, is congratulations to my good friend Bill on this book, which gives important historical context to the Canadian narrative. I'm troubled by the reality that Margaret referred to, not troubled by Margaret, but troubled by the reality Margaret referred to of facing an overload of issues. The distinguished statistician Edward Deming has had a profound influence on the world through his insight that progress is better made by focusing energy on the critical few rather than the whole. I wonder if the panelists feel we need to make choices which limit the scope of our energy as we face multiple challenges. That's a beautiful question. And I know there's one or two more, and apologies. I think that we're going to have to end on this question. So let me invite Martin and Margaret and Shawn and Heather and David to weigh in.
So the question about the new immigrant, we'll just touch very briefly together on that. We come from, Heather and I, families and communities, and we don't want to speak for other Indigenous peoples or nations across the world, but I think it's a very well-known it's well known now and better understood now, importantly because of both the education system, the work in government and politics, important work by yourself, David, and others who've carried stories the likes of which I never thought I would read in national newspapers, where we saw ourselves reflected back. And that included the deep trauma. And neuroscience tells us now how early childhood trauma, intergenerational trauma impacts the brain and the way that we think. It impacts how it is that we view the world, where we can take something that is potentially just neutral and it becomes something that's difficult. And I heard that earlier referenced about being victims and being oppressors, etc. And so Heather and I spent the last 6 years mainly focused on this topic, and share briefly an experience that we had right here on the West Coast that I think ties in with this.
Yeah, and I think, the question was about how do you instill, for someone coming from a war-torn country, immigrating to Canada, how do you instill that? And there's no easy answer. However, where there is, and I think this goes back to that conversation, Margaret, that you touched on around where are those areas of common intersection. And I think for Indigenous people, and then for immigrants that are coming from war-torn, in this case, the issue raised was war-torn experiences, is a shared understanding of what trauma does. And trust and even loyalty and love of country, there's an element of safety and trust that's implicit in that. And so I think for anyone coming, it is about the relationships. We met a family recently, new to the area we're in. They're from Syria. They'd come over as part of a relocation that had occurred. They had no friends. They didn't have a close relationship. Shawn and I received our load of food fish from home, which is a conversation for another time. Had our salmon, which is our cultural and our ceremonial food fish for the winter, and we brought fish up, and we'd made a connection, and they'd been here only under a year, and we brought our fish, and we didn't speak much. They didn't speak much English, and we were able to exchange and share stories, and it really started that simply. There was no complicated effort to build that relationship about the land. And in our teachings, that's where it really starts. It's about being up high stuff, to be that friendly, to be welcoming, to do it in a way that is very soft. And we brought fish, and we shared fish. We brought them 2 large salmon. It brought back fond memories for them. They come from a fishing community. And we just started very small. And of course, those moments, you don't do them to grow them into large moments. However, it did turn into a bigger moment. It forged deep relationships. It was the conversations later that led to the curiosity, to sharing some stories about how is it that you move past trauma, the pain, the hurt, the fear. And that is where Indigenous peoples and new immigrants that come from countries that have deep trauma have an ability to start connecting. Is first to share a meal. We say that everything is easier when it's going down. Our teachings are to talk about difficult issues when we're eating, because the food goes down, and so do the difficult discussions. Mm. And so for us, we start very small. They seem like very, very simple, and not to uncomplicate it, but I mean to keep growing that, what each of us can do, and to look at that shared history of trauma. And I think also Indigenous peoples at a global level, there's a real opportunity for Canada. We talked about when's the last time Canada had conversations with leaders that they disagreed with. I'll tell you that Indigenous leaders are often meeting with leaders of the countries that Canada disagrees with. There is a tremendous opportunity to use that as a corner in many moments. Russia was one of the major countries that supported the Sukhote Nation, which is the only nation that's won title in Canada. They have title to their land. And it was interestingly, because it was Russia who gave up their seat at the United Nations so the Chakotans could speak. And so when we returned to the United Nations 2 years ago now, there was some diplomacy done with Russia to say thank you for that seat. And this time Canada as well offered up their seat for a little extra time at the forum. But it was Russia and including China. First Nations leaderships have been instilling relationship with China. Interestingly, after the big earthquake, it was a delegation of First Nations leadership that went over, raised a totem pole, and started some of that international diplomacy working through some of this. So there's some opportunities and some angles that we may not have considered at the global scale, bringing together the brilliance of the Indigenous leadership and Canadian leadership coming together in this era of reconciliation.
And I think that you two are part of that. So I want to thank you so much. I think we're going to have to move on because Bill, I know, has a few things he wants to say.